Good morning. Welcome to our class together today. We're doing something a little bit different. We were about to study Matthew, but that has changed. And so we're going to take a little bit of time asking a simple question about who we are. And by doing that, we can understand more about ourselves as the church. So let me ask you the question, who are we? We describe ourselves in a lot of different ways. We sometimes, if you were to say, this is who I am, we'll use our hobbies that we participate in, or we have our occupation that we earn money with, or the organizations we belong to. But we do know that identity changes your behavior. For instance, a chef who is a different thing than a cook, even though they both do the same thing. What you call yourself and what you are called will determine who you are. But what happens if we take that question, ask it not of individuals, but of ourselves as the church together? Are we a location of people who assemble once a week? Are we an organization? Are we a religion? All of those things create a nuance. So this morning, briefly, let's see if we can determine our identity through the lens of Scripture. So, what has the church been called in the New Testament? When you come to the pages of the New Testament, you find the church scattered through it, and it's mentioned in various ways. It's called different things, and that kind of gives us a hint to the answer to the question, who we are. James, for instance, in James chapter 1 and verse 1, refers to the church using Old Testament references. And while he may be talking to Jewish Christians, he's still talking to Christians. So he takes them back to the root of an existence. Jacob had 12 sons who became the father of the tribes and the clans of Israel. We read of them coming out of Egypt or settling in various parts of Canaan, which would bear the name of the tribe. And for James, that seems to be an apt description, for he calls them to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. That's one way you can refer to the church. Or Paul would refer to it in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 19 as we are members of the household of God. See, Paul gets more intimate. He calls the church the household of God. It seems to be appropriate. Households are organized. They bear new children and raise them to maturity. It's a familiar image that we're all very much aware of. For that reason, it has this emotional impact on us. If the church is a household, what's your household like? That may be the image that you carry into this idea. In Acts, sometimes it's just referred to as the church, as it is in Acts chapter 5 and verse 11, where it says, "And great fear came upon the whole church." It may sound kind of plain, but it does have a sense, as we're going to see a little later in this lesson. Then Paul again takes it with another metaphor, another image. He says, "For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body." Now the image is kind of embedded in that translation, but in Ephesians 5:23, he compares the church to a wife in a marriage, or a bride, if you will. It's been how it's been described in days past. The church is the wife or the bride of Christ, and Christ is the husband, and that brings a different view of what we are as well. But then we come to something very, very common to us. In Romans 16:16, it refers to the churches of Christ. I have seen on numerous signs in small towns all over America that the church is prevalent in. They use this passage as a peg for the tagline for the sign outside of town that says, "The Church of Christ meets here," usually with their address. But I think that's a term that needs broader explanation that we will get to in this lesson. So think about all those images. The 12 tribes, the church, the bride of Christ, the household of God, the churches of Christ. Notice there's not one, but several. They are descriptive terms. So what does all of this indicate about us? Well, first of all, let's start with the 12 tribes in James chapter 1 and verse 1. What did that indicate in the Old Testament? Well, it indicated the entire nation of Israel. It was kind of like the term in the Three Musketeers is all for one and one for all. That kind of carried the freight for all of this. They were brothers of a family, but more importantly, they were God's chosen people put together. God chose 12 tribes as His family. And when those 12 tribes are put together, they are the 12 tribes of God. They are God's family in total. That describes the church, doesn't it? We are the completeness of what God's family looks like. But then you go and you find that image of the household of the saints in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 19. Now, what comes to mind when you use the term household? I think it's interesting that sometimes we think about household and everyone has a different image. Now mine, I got to tell you, is I had two parents and a brother and me. That was our household. We moved around from time to time, not very often, but sometimes. And we were all different people, still are, or we still were at least. But we were bound together as family. That's a different idea. It's that idea that Paul brings to the church. We're not an organization of people who just belong to something. Instead, we are related by the blood of Christ. In all families, the members care for each other and see to the needs of each other. There's a whole lot laden in that term household that perhaps we need to unpack further as we go along. But when one hurts, we all hurt. I remember a dilemma we had when we were about to move back to Richardson in the year 2000. We had a daughter who was a junior in high school. Now that presents all kinds of problems for a father who's in the middle of moving right at the beginning of school. And the house had not quite sold, and so we still had a house there, and for a brief time we toyed with an idea of that Vicki and Randy would stay back in Santa Fe, Texas, and she would continue to go to school, and then when we sold our house, then they would make the move. That didn't take very long to figure out, because it finally came down to a moment where we said, we move together. Wherever we go together. And so we uprooted her out of the first week of school and brought her to a different place where she hated it for a while, hated me for a while. But we were the household. That same sense bears witness to what the church is. We all move together. And that's what households do. But then, in Acts chapter 5 and verse 11, that plain Jane concept of the whole church, the church, that's trickier. It's layered with it a lot of misunderstandings. In fact, we talk in various ways and use that term church that way. We talk about going to church. And we mean attending worship. Sometimes when I have to leave my house and come to the church building for something, I will always tell my wife, I'm headed to church. But obviously, I'm just referring to a structure that sits at 1409 North Waterview Drive in Richardson, Texas. But when I was a boy, I remember preachers being very fond of saying that the church was the called out. And they had some interesting mental gymnastics that they twisted a Greek term out of shape with. And they said, well, we are special because God called us out of the world to be special. Now, while that may be true, you can't hang that on the term church. It soaps well as a preacher, but you're poorly informed if that's how you use it, because it doesn't really capture what that term meant in the first century. In fact, it's used other places that have nothing to do with what we call church. In Acts chapter 19, it is maybe the best interpreter of that term that we have. Alexander and the silversmiths in Ephesus gather in opposition to Paul. They go to the huge arena there, and his preaching has caused a problem. It has stirred them to a fever pitch because his preaching of the one and only God and the conversion of people to that God and to that Christ have cut into the lucrative sale of their silver statues of the idol of the goddess Diana when the pilgrims would come and buy at market. And so they are pounding, they are stomping, they are creating all kinds of confusion. It's about to break into a riot when the town clerk, who is comparable to our modern day sheriff, came and quieted the crowd and spoke to them. But it describes the sense there. In verse 32, it said, "Now some cried out one thing and another, and there was nothing more than confusion. And most of them did not even know why they had come together." And it uses the term, the assembly was in confusion. But when the town clerk comes and speaks to them, he also says to them, he says, "But if you seek anything further, this should be settled in a regular assembly." See, that word assembly is the same exact Greek word church. It simply means for us that the church are those who assemble together. That's what church means. That's what church is. And so when a church is used, when the word church is used, it means that we come together. We assemble for a common purpose. And obviously the most common purpose is the assembly of worship. But it is the togetherness in one place that signifies church the most. When we are together in some way, we are the church. And even during the pandemic, when we seem to be all spread apart, when we would come together on Sundays in all of our houses, even online, even as distressing as that was for all of us, in one sense, we were still the church because we were together. But what about that concept of the bride of Christ that Paul uses in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 23? See, when Paul refers to the bride of Christ, he stresses two ideas. One of those is intimacy and closeness of the relationship. In all of life, there is no relation as close as husband and wife. It encompasses physical, spiritual, and emotional joining. Nothing comes close to it. But the way it is put is that Christ and the bride are bound together. That's the concept of that image. She is married to Jesus, which is an exclusive relationship. She belongs to him in the same way as when you put a wedding ring on a finger, it says, "I now belong to another." It is this tie that Paul uses to communicate about marriage. And then Romans 16:16, churches of Christ. Is it just a sign on the building? Or does it describe something else? Now, the language can be kind of strange. All languages are. And many times you can say the same thing in different ways. For instance, you can say, "This is Robert's book." And that's usually how we refer to it. But you could also put it this way: "This is the book of Robert." Or a better way is say, "This is the book which belongs to Robert." But the last, one of those is more awkward. The one that says, "This is the book of Robert," doesn't sound right, in English at least, but it's perfectly acceptable. And it sounds like that in how Paul wrote it. Because Paul describes the church as a possession of Christ. All the assemblies of Christians throughout all the world belong to Christ. He is their head and their guide. They derive their life from him. And I feel like we've kind of drained all the life out of that expression, churches of Christ, when we put it only as a title that we etch in marble on the front of a building. It describes a relationship, a possession that Christ has, something he's bought with his own blood. That's a powerful image. when you think of it that way, not just this is what we call the church. So, what aroma does that leave with us? You know what aromas are. I'm always fascinated by that concept. It's things that we hear that it's easy for us to define, but there's something that swirls around inside of us that gives us an impression. It gives us an emotional response. Now, it's like kind of waking up in the morning and the coffee has just started and you can smell the coffee brewing. It gives you a visceral, emotional experience, an impression, a sense that words can't express. So what do these things tell us about the church? I want you to think of these 4 pictures. They are the essence of the church. We are family. Just as human families that have problems, we also have problems, but it is the primary way we give care and concern. Second, we are together. We're joined together in places, but joined together in heart. It is the joining, that is togetherness, that is important. We have a unity of purpose and goal. With one head, we travel together in the same direction to reach that same goal. And we show love for each other, just as Christ loved us. We love each other. In a world of distance, the church provides the love people need. So, these are the pictures that the Bible tells us about what God wants of His church. He wants the intimacy with Him, the unity together, the family feel, the sense of togetherness. And we must be able to accomplish those things if we hope to be the church described in the New Testament, as we say we are. And that's what we're going to explore in these few lessons together. Today I want to leave you with the feeling that all of those things bring. I want to tell you about John Fawcett. Fawcett preached for a small church in Wainsgate, England. And being small, it paid poorly. I understand it. My first church was like that. But he had a growing family and he needed more money and they couldn't pay it. And so he needed some place that they could provide the resources for his family. And a larger church in town invited him to come and be their preacher, and he accepted. The salary would double. So he got together his family, his possessions. They loaded everything on the wagon. But something happened. His wife said, "John, I just can't leave this place. I love them too much." And on that last Sunday, he announced he was staying. With tears in his eyes, he expressed the love he had for that church, because it was more than a place to work. And he captured the image in a song. Blessed be the tie that binds our hearts in Christian love. The fellowship of kindred minds is like to that above. Before our Father's throne, we pour our ardent prayers. Our fears, our hopes, our aims are one. Our comforts and our care. We share our mutual woes, our mutual burdens bear, and often for each other flows the sympathizing tear. And when we call to part, it gives us inward pain, but we shall still be joined in heart and hope to meet again. That is the picture of the church. I want to thank you for joining me. But before I leave, I wanted to make one quick announcement. We're working on trying to find a way to where we can just have a live presentation on Sunday morning in the class I teach in the chapel. It's not quite there yet, but when it does, I'll let you know. It will save me a lot extra time, and right now my time is getting pretty slim. But I will continue to do these because I enjoy them so much, enjoy being with you every week. And so I hope you've enjoyed this class and will continue as every Sunday with us, even when we go live, but I'll let you know that before it happens. So take care, have a great day, and it was good to be with you today.